Josh, the tether between real world consequences and how we perceive the world has frayed dangerously thin, and it's almost severed. Why is this a problem? I think the big issue, in a sense, is that when people have it too easy, you create this problem of excess. You create this problem of pleasure. Here's what I mean by this. The comments oftentimes raised from an economic perspective, we financialize the economy. It's just a fancy way of saying that the way we value goods and services, and particularly companies, really has no bearing or very little bearing on what the company actually does. This is not an economics video, but I just simply want to throw that out there as a concept. I think we, in a sense, have committed the same sin of sorts when it comes to how we deal with the business of the species. I'll go into that in just a second. But my point is the reward mechanisms that we have set up and the way we perceive reward mechanisms are being gamed, and they're being gamed by ourselves without us realize that we're gaming them. Here's what I mean by this. When people substitute face-to-face interaction or interaction with another human being, which I think all of us need, even if you're the most extreme introvert, but when it becomes substitute with social media, or social media steps as a stand-in for that, you have this chasm between reality, like actually seeing someone, sitting across to someone face to face, or even engaging in a virtual conversation like this with you or whoever ends up watching it. But my point is that when you have the virtual stepping in to provide a synthetic alternative for the real, the balance between these, keeping these things in order, can easily become out of whack. And so the financialization, essentially, of the social economy would be the equivalent of, from the male perspective, easy access to porn. From the female perspective, it might be cheap, easy access to social validation. And while both men and women, in this case, and when I call it the business of the species, what I mean is the mating and dating, or the mating and dating construct, which the species has to go into because we have to renew ourselves, or at least until ectogenesis gets here in a meaningful manner. But the point is that when you have this being gamed, you have a reward circuit up here, that we're hardwired into, and men and women differently based upon their biology. And you have this gaming of it. And with the gaming of it, you're basically able to get the reward without putting in the effort. If you don't put in the effort to get it, then you have this hollowing out, this financialization of the economy. So here's a simple example of this. If you go back to, let's say, the 1940s and the 1950s, the mating and dating game was very different than the mating and dating game here we are of the 2020s. And the point was, back then, sure, there was more scarcity and there was more constraints placed both on men and women. There was not nearly as much freedom as you and I have today. But at the same time, you could make the argument that the price that you had to pay for constraining the liberty and constraining the options, and by forcing conformity onto the group as a whole, the argument is what we got from that was more stable social relationships. Now,
well, also it has a lot to do with the amount of sexual counterparts that men and women have today, especially women. I remember having this talk to my grandmother specifically. And she was talking about, oh, before I married my husband, I had a few boyfriends here and there, and I recall that. Well, how many did you have? She was like, 2. She was like, yeah, I got around quite a bit. She was like, I had all my fun and stuff like this, and I was like, oh, like, would you sleep with them or anything like that? And just kind of like probe some questions. Oh God, no. Oh, for heaven's sake, no, I wouldn't do that. Yeah. And compare that today. Now you're not even dating people and you're having just casual sex with as many people as humanly possible. People don't realize the downfall that's going to have down in the future. But I would say the main point of this video is the scientific revolution and the scientific advancements that we've had. You would think that is always going to be beneficial to society. But when you have too much of a good thing, not only does it turn bad, but it could have catastrophic damages.
Yeah, and if I can modify that for 1 second, it's not if you have too much of a good thing, but like, if you don't already know, I was formerly trained as an accountant. So in my world, every debit has to have a credit, okay? And so my point is that if you bring something online, if you bring back, like, say, the reward circuitry, think like a drug like heroin or cocaine or whatever, right? You can chemically hit all the high notes up here, and there might be a time and a place to do that. But you also have to develop the mental discipline to say, well, wait a minute, we've got this very powerful substance here. And if we're not very careful with it, if we don't show it the respect that it deserves, we're essentially going to conjure a demon in the process of doing this. And this gets back into, what I would call the mating and dating scene right now. And I think there's a lot of people who are not very happy, and if they continue along this path, probably will never be as happy as they otherwise could be. from it. And more importantly, this is, I think, the larger issue, is that from the male perspective, and probably from the female perspective as well, but as a guy, or at least last time I checked, that's the perspective I'll speak from, because that's what I know. It can become very easy for men to check out if they want to check out. And that itself is a problem, because when you have men checking out of society, especially the young generations of the millennials, or, the Zoomers, coming on up, this is problematic, especially if it's easy to check out. Because if it's easy to check out, then what's the point? And you get into this weird dynamic where you're able to enjoy all the benefits, but the negative consequences have been ameliorated, or the direct impact of the negative consequences have been ameliorated, although they will eventually come home to roost, just not immediately. That's the key right there. And I just kind of worry that sooner or later, we're going to have to pay the piper.
Men today, let's say an average 18-year-old man compared to a king back in 1000 BC. Right now, the average 18-year-old man that has done absolutely nothing has 1,000 times more opportunity to the technology compared to the king back in the day, even though the king had wealth beyond imagination. Right now, an 18-year-old boy, he can watch as much free porn of the most beautiful women with the best bodies in the world for no cost. If a king wanted to do that, I mean, just try and think about, he would have to pay two people to have sex right in front of him.
Yeah. And Josh, if I could jump in for a second, also consider the perspective of the female too. Cleopatra from back in the day wouldn't hold a candle to some, let's say, 3 or 4 starting up an Instagram account, and think about all the likes she'd get from thirsty dudes. And in terms of social validation, this is what I mean when I say we have these synthetic, mental products that we use.
Yeah, it's not just the mating and dating site though. Let's talk about entertainment. Right now, we could watch the best YouTube videos or movies for virtually free. If an old king wanted to see entertainment, he would have to go to a show or a play, and even that is a fraction of the dopamine spike that you see today. Or read a book. The availability that we have to this dopamine is insane. And I'm going to take an example from a book, Becoming Supernatural by Dr. Joe Dispenza. An example that he used was this woman who, she comes home one day and she finds out that her husband just killed himself. And what does that do? That your stress level during that time would just skyrocket. Your cortisol would spike up and you would be in complete devastation. But what happened? The next week, she continued to relive this moment, whether it is her friends or family coming to the funeral, and then she starts to have issues at work because she obviously just went through something tragic. And then after a few months, she gets fired from her job, and her stress levels just get larger and larger and larger. She still has kids to take care of, and she no longer has the money to support them, and her health starts to deteriorate. And then because her stress is just out of control, she's trying to support her kids through school, but she can't, because then she just got fired from her job, and her health is getting much, much worse. That heightened state of stress, it makes sense if you are getting attacked by a lion. But your body cannot tell the difference between that first moment when she found out that her husband killed herself, and then 5 months later when she got fired from her job and her health started to get worse. Her body just sees, oh, something's going on. We gotta put our stress levels up, and your cortisol shoots up. But when you live in that state for a prolonged period of time, there's going to be some serious implications. That is just talking about stress and cortisone. When you do that with dopamine, when all you do is get sucked in, between watching porn or instant gratification short clips on TikTok or YouTube, or on nonstop shows or movies on Netflix or any of these other sites, you're doing that same damage to your body not just your body, but your mind, that you are not aware of. And when you do this day in and day out, there is going to be severe downside in the future. And this is going to be the real first generation that goes through their lifespan of experience this. And I can assume that the downside could be much worse than anyone could really foresee now.
The funny thing about porn that I find interesting is that it's so ubiquitous and it's so free. Someone's got to pay for this, and nobody works for free. So I find that to be a very interesting.
Yeah. If you don't know who the customer is, It is you, my friend.
You are the customer. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, just I guess like from a philosophical standpoint, what I find interesting is that I came at this from the financial world, Josh, as probably you did as well to an extent, and we could definitely opine about that nonsense. But there's this theme of the real world on one side, like, or the world of reality over here, and then the world that we create in our mind. And the world we create in our mind is arguably just as real, even though it's not as tangible or whatever, right? And as long as these worlds are in sync, you have some stability. Now, you don't want to be perfectly in sync. I think you want a little bit of give, because that's how you have creativity and kind of enter the system and change things and disrupt things in a good way. But you also don't want them to be completely out of sync. And that's, I think, where you run into problems right now. But anyways, interesting times.
What do you think the long-term consequences of the extreme instant gratification world that we live in, and not being forced to do anything with your life? Because you used to, if you wanted to get the hot chick, what you would do is you would bust your ass. You would do as much as you humanly could to get a good job, to make a lot of money, and to be the best version of yourself as you possibly could be. And then you could get the girl. But now you can get you could get the girl, and you can get all the things that money can buy as entertainment or instant gratification. Therefore, you don't need, or at least you don't think that you need all that other stuff, or you have to do anything else. Instead, it's very easy to blame other people. And the problem with that is man needs passion. He needs something to get him up in the morning. If you were just a walking zombie, just living day in and day out, just using these instant gratification sites with doing absolutely nothing, there's nothing to you. And people know that deep down, even if they don't want to admit it.
No, that's pretty much hits the nail on the head. I think sooner or later we will correct back to the norm. I think that's a given. The question is how much pain, how much blood, how much death do we have to go through?
But well, you say that, but let's take the example of the beautiful ones. A study done on mice back in the day. They put all these mice in a utopian world where they had unlimited food and shelter, that they would never need to do anything again. And I mean, at first it was great. All the mice were super happy. But as time went on, the men started to prune themselves all day, preen themselves all day, and masturbate themselves to death, while the women turned to be much more like men, because the men stopped protecting the fortress. They stopped trying to be the strongest mice to protect their family. And so the women, they just started to get very feisty and manly.
They stopped having babies. They would engage in
they would no longer mate with any of those pathetic men, because there was no need to. And we can see that today, where women are having sex with fewer and fewer of the men, and the small percent of men who are having sex with much more women, because they're the top 1% and all the women want them, whereas they wouldn't even touch the average 50% male, but more and more men are going into that average 50 percentile. What happened with the study? The mice population it completely ceased to exist.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, is that the only reason women would sleep with the top 10% is because they can't not otherwise sleep with the top 1%. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's just...
Water is blue, and the
sky is blue and water is wet. And like, this is, I just think, what will happen normally. But the catch is that for the residual that's left, there are only so many creative options we can engage in society. And what's more, if you need the most optimal way we have to develop children so that they themselves can develop stable children and so on and so forth down the line, is to have a 2-parent household with a mom and a dad. You start running into some interesting complications. One of the things, and I'll just kind of leave it on this note, that I'm curious to see where this goes, because I think this is a problem, is I'm really curious to see what happens with ectogenesis. Like when that becomes, and what ectogenesis is, that's an artificial womb for all intents and purposes. I'd be very curious to see how that changes the dynamic in this regard.
I mean, you can spew it however you want. I don't think it's going to do anything. The babies, they want to have a mother and father. There was a study that was done that kind of, it took a few different groups of mothers, and they cradled their babies differently, and then the babies grew up after a long period of time. And what they saw was, after the babies who became most successful were the ones who were cradled the most, and the ones that got the most support from both parents, from the mother and father, not the ones who were the least looked at or only had a mother or a father.
Yeah, my point, Josh, is that I think we all certainly know what the optimum phrase or what the optimal situation might be from past experience. But if you're facing a demographic bomb where you're looking at a population collapse, you can't play the card that you wish you could play. You've got to play the cards that you have. And I find that to be a very interesting. And there's some other, ways you can kind of goose the results as well. But I'd be very curious to see how that would play out. And I think that sooner or later we will get a version of it. But
Yeah,
let's
I
not
think
get
I
ahead
think
of
a lot of
ourselves.
men right now blame women for being whores, and I mean rightfully so. I don't necessarily disagree with that statement. And women blame men
Yeah.
for being pathetic, and they're right too, because I would say both of them are very accurate with their statements right now.
Yeah, I would say fundamentally the problem falls on men, and the problem falls on weak men for allowing the situation to get to this. I've always quipped that the zombie apocalypse is weak, beta-thirsty men who are so desperate for a taste of action that they'll do absolutely anything, and Lord knows they exist in a great multitude. And the funny thing, too, is that I don't think women fundamentally want it either. Like, I think it's almost... Oh, I'm back.
No, I mean, it makes sense. Let's say you're a woman today, and you're with some guy, but he turns out to be a complete bitch, like complete, just blue pill, just woke, just disgusting dude. And then you're like, all right, well, I guess I'll go to the next one. And then it's the same thing, and it's the same thing, and it's the same thing until they eventually find some dude who is really good, but he doesn't want her because she's been shifled through. Or there's such few men out there that are like that. There's no ability for those women to have a high valued man.
Yeah, and what's more, the high value man knows he's got options. So you get this dynamic where you have this you're optimizing for the wrong thing, and the reason you're optimized, I think what goes on is that if you optimize for complete and 100% individual freedom, you can do that, but there's a cost to it. Just likewise, there's a massive cost if you optimize for, let's say, society conformity. And this gets back into, the fourth turning and, just how the pendulum's going to swing. And when it's going to swing is, I guess, really the question that we're trying to answer here. I would lay the blame at the feet of weak men and men in general for tolerating this. Because if men just stood up and said, like, look, this is ridiculous, we're not going to play this game anymore. I would think that you would see three things happen. Number one, there'd be screeching, how dare you? But once you got past the initial nonsense there, you would see men make themselves better versions of themselves.
Yeah, think about our grandparents' generation. How many counterparts do you think your grandparents have? Compare that to your friends today.
Oh, materially less.
Not even just less. It is hysterically less compared to how it is today, and it was looked down upon back in the day. That's besides the point. If me and Justin, who I don't think a single person on this planet would be considering us the toughest dudes, than the most alpha, that are having to say the shit that is going on, what has society come to? Because in any generation, me and Justin are the weak men, but right now, like, just because the standard is so fucking low, we are the ones that are having to say this when we just absolutely shouldn't be.
Yeah, but lastly, I'll say this. There is, I think, a glimmer of hope. Like, consider Andrew Tate, for example. I disagree with some of the conclusions that he jumps to. I do think that he did a very good job of identifying some of the symptoms and, giving a voice to it. And I think because he was able to give a voice to it and spoke the truth, and the truth resonated, particularly with the younger generations, I thought that was an interesting thing. And in a strange way, I was pleased to see that, and not even commenting on, the fact that once you start, going against the narrative and you blow that up, boy, do they come after you, and they come after you hard. And of course, Tate's not the only one that's done that. There's another person who's been in the news recently, but let's not go there.
Yep.
So
thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.